So what I want to do today is talk about several things. I'm going to talk about global drivers a little bit, but actually most of the things that we're concerned with as practical ecologists and so on is really happening on a very local scale. So I make no apologies for not talking about big global issues and so on, and hopefully a lot of the stuff I'll say will be positive. So I'll be talking about ecosystem services, which is a buzzword in the community at the moment. But I'm also going to be talking about what role we can play as mainstream ecologists, particularly within YESI, but within the British Ecological Society as well, because I think our time has come to make a difference here. And actually, my talk is really all about engagement. And engagement across the disciplines, engagement with policymakers, engagement with the wider issues that are out there. It's not going to be an easy road because there are prejudices on either side, and sometimes the natural scientists don't understand the social scientists, and the social scientists really treat us as quite anal. That's quite right, actually, we are in the way we do our science. We just need to get over these kinds of barriers. I'll leave it for you to decide which one is the ecologist and which one is the social scientist. What I'm going to do today is talk about, in very general terms, about the issues we have with trying to implement something called the ecosystem approach, of which ecosystem services is very central. And many countries now throughout the world are actually got to grips after 10 years of the outputs of many of these documents, most famous, of course, and influential, being the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment, the Convention on Biological Diversity Statement on the Ecosystem Approach, which nearly 200 government ministers have signed up to, none of whom read it, obviously, because they didn't realise what the implications would be, and some other things like TEEB, but also more recently in the United Kingdom, the UK's National Ecosystem Assessment, which Georgina talked a bit about yesterday, and these have really prompted national governments, and I'll be talking very parochial here about the UK, to actually adopt an ecosystem approach in its broadest sense to environmental management and trying to look at the consequences of interventions when we try to manage the environment. And that's also been taken forward at quite high levels in many governments throughout the world into national accounts or green accounts, which are becoming all the fad now. We have a natural capital committee within the United Kingdom on which there are card-carrying biodiversity ecologists like Rosie Hales and so on from CH, Ian Bateman, who's an economist who's gone over to the dark side. He's become an ecologist. And there's lots of areas within, this is one for Canada, which has, a huge spatial extent of boreal forest. And what they're trying to do is exactly the same sort of things we're trying to do in the United Kingdom, is to try and account for our natural assets that we have, both in terms of the stocks and the services. And the green boxes there are highlighted some of the areas where I think card-carrying ecologists, mainstream ecologists, can actually make a significant contribution to this debate, and not only can, should. The central tenet of the ecosystem approach is this thing called ecosystem services, which I'm not going to spend too long on defining. What I want to do, actually, is two things. One, to promote a paper, which you'll all read, which we've written from Advances in Ecological Research, which, of course, you have to do in these things. The other thing is the exponential increase that you can see here in the number of publications. This work comes from Gary Peterson, Stockholm Stockholm Resilience Centre. An exponential explosion in the number of papers on ecosystem services. But if you look down the initiatives which have prompted that on this axis here, the one on the left, what you will see is that there are, sorry, you're right, what you will see is that many of them have a distinctive economics element to them. So there's TEEB, there's a Stern report, there's chunks of the MEA, from environmental economists and so on, Daly, Costanza, various other people have well-known economic leanings. And, of course, Garrett Hardin right down the bottom there. And the question we have to address, I think, as mainstream ecologists is, are we going to let them get away with that and run away with ecosystem services and probably do it all wrong? And I think many of the economists probably are doing that, so sorry to any of you in the audience here, but as your economists, you probably won't own up to being one anyway. And because ecosystem services is coming into mainstream ecological thinking as well as in the decision-making agenda, I think it's about time we stepped up to the plate as a group and said, hang on, this is how you do it. So what can mainstream ecologists offer? And I think it's appropriate to ask that given, the 100 years of the British Ecological Society, because much of actually what we're talking about with the ecosystem approach and ecosystem services does come from the work of people within the British Ecological Society at some stage or another. And here's what we can do, I think. I'm just going to give you 2 examples and then perhaps a word of encouragement at the end as well. We know that ecosystem services are actually the flows from stocks of capital. You can think about it like your bank account. So Sue here has £500,000 in the bank, and she gets a flow of revenue from that. Let's say she gets 10p. If she spends more than 10p, then that erodes into her capital stock, and then she has less than 10p to spend next year, and so on. So you can think of natural capital stocks in that sense, and they produce a flow of benefits for us for society. Not just one thing like food, but lots of other things as well. And then the flows, they're the outcomes, they're the things which have significant value to us. We've heard a lot about the top one, we've heard about things like food production and so on, but they also produce a number of other more sort of touchy-feely things for us ecologists, aesthetic and cultural experiences as well. And those are quite difficult to capture. And we actually have to value these different kinds of stocks and these flows in very different ways. So I won't go into that now. I'll talk to people about that afterwards. But they are very, very different. So what are the key questions for ecologists to answer in this agenda? Well, I think, because I'm biased, that there are 3 basic areas where mainstream ecologists within the British Ecological Society can actually contribute to this whole agenda. And these are the 3 questions. And they have actually been posed by a Natural Environment Research Council in the programme, which is highlighted on the bottom right there. So NERC is spending £14 million on trying to answer these questions and funding about 100 ecologists to do this, most of whom are actually in the British Ecological Society, and many of them are in the audience here as well. So it's obviously something which the government is taking seriously and recognises that the ecological research community can contribute to this. So what we have here is a stock, a lump of natural capital. It has flows of different kinds of services coming out of it. And the question is, what's the relationship between the dynamical form of those stock flow relationships? And you now need to come down to the front here and perform a dance. Actually, it probably won't be a pretty sight, so I'll carry on. So what's the form of that relationship between capital stocks and flows? How much of this stuff can we take out without reducing that capital stock too far? Is that a linear relationship in that we keep taking out those yields? Will that stock gradually contract? Or will it actually get to a certain size where actually it's not possible to take out any more of that yield? There must be a significant a minimum level of that stock, and that's likely to differ for different kinds of ecosystem services. So, 1 square metre of carbon will probably of woodland will probably fix as much carbon as 100 square kilometres per unit area. But actually, 1 square metre of woodland is not very good for recreation, whereas 100 square kilometres may well be. So these dynamics are not going to be simple. They're going to be non-linear, as you might expect from complex systems. And the second thing is, and this is what we're trying to address today, I suppose, is how will future global drivers, and anticipating those is a real problem, affect the stocks and flows? Well, population pressure will obviously be one of those. We have to feed another 3 billion people on the planet. Much of that will probably be grown in the UK. The UK wants to increase its own food security by growing more food. That means either more intensive food production and everything that that generates for the environment, or more extensive. So we need to solve this. We can't walk away from it or just say, no, you can't do this. And ecologists need to be involved with that as well. And climate change as well. And then we need to know what's happening to the stocks and flows, and we have to define appropriate tools and metrics which enable us to do this. And believe it or not, there aren't many out there which we can use, which are very sensible for things other than provisioning services, food, timber, sheep, cattle, and so on. One of the other ways, I think, in which we can approach this stocks and flows area as mainstream ecologists is just to reflect on where we've come from. And actually, we're pretty good at doing this sort of stuff in mainstream ecology. This is a ecosystem diagram from Point Barrow, Alaska, which was part of the International Biological Program. It comes from E.B. Worthington's book. And we're very good at measuring the size of those boxes, the stocks, and what goes along those black arrows, the flows between them. It can be measured in material, can be measured in terms of energy and so on, but we're very, very good at doing that, and we have a long history of this, and this is basically systems analysis. So stocks and flows are the stuff of ecosystem ecology, and I think the British Ecological Society can actually has a huge number of people directly involved with ecosystem ecology or surrounding it, can actually contribute much to this story by looking at these frameworks. Now, there's lots of ways in which you can do that. Here's some stuff that's being funded at the moment by the Value in Nature Network. Comes from Lawrence Jones in particular. It's about the production of wheat as a flow of materials from a stock of material. So this is just a cartoon of it. And what these systems ecologists are trying to do is trying to build models of that big circle there and then translate that into flows. It's actually very complex, and it's very kind of deterministic and a little bit reductionist. So here's the fine detail from Lawrence's paper. Lots of different things to measure, from rainfall to soil quality to pH, all those sorts of things. And the idea is you can put these all into this magnificent model, you'll actually get a flow of ecosystem services out. It works. They have done this. And it works for production services, it works for regulating services, and it works quite well for cultural services as well. So that will be hitting the headlines fairly soon when, unfortunately, it's a multi-author paper, and of course the amount of time it takes to complete that increases exponentially with the number of authors. But that will come out fairly soon. But actually there are other more holistic ways that I want to talk about of actually trying to do this, and these are these are to do with systems ecology, which actually we haven't embraced very well as a community within the UK. It's much more fashionable to do this in Europe and North America than it ever was here. And one of the reasons of this is you can take a beautiful system like this, and by the way, this is the best documented food web in the world. It's called the Itham in Scotland, so we know a lot about it, and some of you have actually blighted your PhDs on there, I know that. We can take a beautiful system like that and reduce it to a number of properties. And some of these properties have very unfamiliar concepts, and they're really generated by this school of systems ecology which flowered in the United States in the 70s and the 80s under the auspices of two brothers, Howard Odum, but mostly Eugene Odum. And there are even Odum schools of ecology at the University of Georgia. And this hasn't really connected very well with the more reductionist population dynamics areas within mainstream ecology, particularly in the United Kingdom, because it involves concepts like ecosystems doing work, and that work is directed to a goal. Well, this is pretty teleological, and actually most Popperian scientists really don't like that kind of language. It also has a number of interesting concepts associated with it, like exergy, system overhead. I'll explain what some of these things are later. Ascendancy, windows of vitality, emergy, and so on. And actually, I remember trying to read this stuff as a postgraduate student, and I just gave up, because the language involved is so difficult. And I have to say, the systems ecology school hasn't actually reached out to the more reductionist people who work on population and community dynamics, like myself, in order to try and clarify that. And as a result, there's been a schism. So here's a quote from Brown, which is part of a eulogy to Eugene Odum, who died many years ago. The holistic approach was seen as blasphemous, not to be trusted in a world where reductionism and small-scale biology held reign. And in fact, many of the reductionist population ecologists in the United States called people who followed this more sort of systems ecology approach Odumites. And that has all sorts of connotations. Now, the other reason why systems ecology has not been taken up very well, I don't think, is it scares the willies out of most students. These horrendograms that are produced, sort of wiring diagrams, this is the Ithon estuary as well, looks a bit different, doesn't it? And that's not very attractive to many of the people who joined up to become ecologists because they like animals and plants. So this is a bit of an abstraction. It's very difficult for people to engage with. But actually, if you pursue this, and we have done this, you can actually find the stocks for this system which produce so those are the circles, the ecosystem services in which we are interested. And this is very, very important because some of those higher level properties can be derived for this network diagram here. The ecosystem services and the stocks can be derived, and you can play around with the size of the stocks and what services you want to extract and see whether those higher level properties, things like ascendancy and exergy, which reflect, and I'm going to use a horrible word now, some aspect of the resilience, persistence, stability of the system, you can see whether actually the system is still stable when you start messing around with it as managers would. So it's, I think, this holistic approach of stocks and flows within this kind of mass balance systems ecology approach is a very useful way to do this. And here's just an example we made earlier. This is ascendancy, or an aspect of ascendancy from Bob Ulanovich. He calls it the windows of vitality. Why do they invent these names? You know, if you're going to alienate a school, this is how you do it. So I've translated it into some things which mainstream ecologists in this country might feel more happy with. Some properties of food web, number of trophic levels, linkage density. And that little box there is where most natural systems lie. The white dots outside are randomly connected systems. And as long as you're within that little window there, doesn't matter how much you mess up the stocks, you change the flows and so on. As long as you're within that window, you're going to be stable and you're going to persist. So that's an example, I think, of how we can use this kind of systems ecology to address stocks and flows. There's another way in which we traditionally, within our mainstream ecological community, tried to address this problem of what's the relationship between capital stocks and flows of services, and that's through small-scale experimentation. Some of these are pretty big scale, as you can see here, spatially in extent, but they're pretty small scale, and then the plots there are actually quite small. So this is typified by the Cedar Creek experiments at Tillman and the biodepth grassland projects, which John Lawton actually coordinated many, many years ago, where you actually seed these areas with different numbers of species, and then you measure some sort of ecosystem function or a process under each treatment within each plot. So you can get a relationship between the number of biodiversity, as Georgina showed yesterday, and some kind of ecosystem function. And that's you can do that in the field. You can do that into a big machine where the light stays on when you close the door, John. That's the Ecotron at Imperial, which unfortunately has now demised, I think. I think Phil Einerson, who's sitting here, might have been the last user of it. And this is absolutely tragic because we don't really have many such facilities left in the UK. That's going to come back and bite us on the bum, I think, closing that. And then we have, just because we were a bit sort of southern envious at Aberdeen, we have a Muddotron, which does the same kind of thing, but it does it in marine environments. So there you are, Al Crowden, that's the genuflection to the marine environment. Now, what Georgina spoke about yesterday was trying to extend that meta-analysis of these beef experiments to ecosystem services. We know that there is a very compelling saturation relationship like this between biodiversity, however you want to measure it, and ecosystem function. There's a brilliant paper in Nature by Brad Cardinale, on which I am not an author. You ought to read that. It has a lot of metadata in the background as well that you can play around with for student projects and so on. The idea is to move beyond these small-scale experiments and try and find some way to link those functions mechanistically to the as underlying processes which affect the delivery of ecosystem services, and then to scale up and do that at the landscape scale using a range of modelling techniques, usually GIS-based techniques like INVEST and so on. And we have some people in the audience here, particularly Tom Oliver and various other people, who have used INVEST for doing these kinds of things. So It is possible to do this in a kind of reductionist way by scaling up from small-scale experiments to larger scale, but there are scaling issues involved there. So I think the mainstream ecologists can make contributions in two areas. They can stick with their reductionist ecology, which helps us understand these mechanisms and build it up that way, and there's a complementary approach by adopting a more systems ecology view of these systems. But just doing the right science isn't enough. And what we have to do is engage with other disciplines. And this is the stuff of Yesi. This is what Sue is trying to do, an engineer at York and various other places. And we not only need to engage with other disciplines, but we need ecological science's voice, as I think one of the last speakers mentioned, previous speakers mentioned, to be heard at the table. Because if we don't have a voice at that table, now we don't have to be advocates, and I'm all against that. We have to produce our science, though, and we have to represent it at the decision-making table. Otherwise, it will be ignored as too difficult or too complex, or it may actually be misinterpreted by other people. We have a responsibility to make sure that voice is heard correctly. That doesn't mean being advocates. Because we often have situations like this where we talk to people about various aspects related to many of the talks we've heard today about what we must do to save the planet, and people just aren't listening. So you can't rely on your papers, you have to get out there and do it. And in order to try and articulate that, I'm going to use a heuristic device, a kind of model that was produced by Kerry Turner for the Natural Capital Committee of the UK. And what Kerry's, and this is in press, what Kerry's trying to get us to understand is that ecologists have to understand how decisions are made. If they don't know that, they can't influence those decisions by giving their scientific evidence in some way. Now, that scientific evidence may be ignored completely, and it often is in decision, but it doesn't make, that's not the point. The fact is that decisions are evidence influenced. They're very rarely evidence-based. They're evidence influenced, and if you don't understand that process, then you can't present your science in the right way. And Kerry envisages three balance sheets, he calls them, the pros and cons, the whys and the wherefores, and so on, that advantages and disadvantages of actions in any decision-making process, whether it's at the farm level, whether it's at the parish level, the regional level, or even for the UK. And the first one is very simple. It's what you call balance sheet one. It's what you might call, and I'm not going to go into it in detail, but a traditional cost-benefit analysis. And actually, mainstream ecologists have a really important role there, because often the value of biodiversity in all these processes we've talked about is not captured. And because it's not captured, it's ignored completely. And it never gets into that cost-benefit analysis. So we have a big role to play there in making sure that those benefits that biodiversity bring are actually captured by that cost-benefit analysis. The second sheet, I don't think we can contribute to very much, apart from citizens in the UK, and that's more to do with local impact analysis of a management intervention on the economy, on jobs and social capital loss. In other words, post offices and schools being lost and things like that. We might have feelings about that, but we don't actually contribute to that, I don't think, as mainstream ecologists. And that's the sort of thing that policymakers and decision makers have to consider. It's not all about the science. And then the third balance sheet, very similar to sort of things that Adrian was talking about first talk. These are multi-criteria methods, which are trying to capture the shared values that people have, which can't be expressed in any monetary way, but they are important. And we need to capture those as well. And those balance sheets kick in at various stages along the decision-making process, depending on how wicked or simple the environmental problem is. So if it's simple, we can get away with a cost-benefit analysis. If it's very wicked, like we want to kill all the badgers in the UK, what are we going to do about that? Then you actually have to go the whole hog here and look at all this. And you have to understand that if you're going to use your science or present your science in a particular way. So engagement is everything. There will be lots of misunderstandings, and there will be lots of compromises that we will have to make. But unless we're engaged as a scientific community, unless we're prepared to work across the disciplines and to understand the decision-making process, to move beyond the jars of coloured water and the machines with flashing lights, unless we're prepared to do that, we won't make an effective difference.